me. I'm Barbara Ballantyne, biology faculty here at Western, and I'm here to sort of facilitate our discussions of the presentations of our presenters. I think it's Tolupe, is that correct? I think I heard you say it before, but now it's morning and I don't know if I did it right. And Hannah, Austin, Lauren, and am I missing somebody? Can't see
Charlene.
everybody.
Yep.
Oh, Charlene, I'm sorry, Charlene, you're right there. I see you. Okay, so we all watched the videos and we're here to ask each other questions and talk about our research and giving presentations and I guess whatever you want to talk about. So does anybody have any burning questions or want to get started? How did it
sure.
go?
I'll start asking questions.
Hi, Charlene. Nice to see you.
So I don't know if we need to like remind people of what we do. I guess everyone saw the stuff. So I'm a historian and I do environmental history research. So I focus on animals and I did elk with Smoky Mountain National Park, as everyone saw. But Tolulope, actually, I was sort of curious about your research. I thought that it was really fascinating learning about bioabsorption. And since I'm not a biologist or a chemist, I found everybody's actually research fascinating. And sometimes it's hard to follow for me. But for the most parts, I get the gist of everything. And I was sort of curious about like out in the world applications of using peanut hulls for absorbing metals like you had showed in your research, and if you thought about applications for your research in the world.
Yeah, it's like normally in United States, or should I say everywhere in the world, there has been this problem of contamination of waters. And a lot of people has been complaining about it, and they don't really know the kind of holistic approach to solve everything. So now we noticed that the rapid increase in the number of industries in the world is increasing the number of contaminations in the environment. So what we're just planning to do now is to use waste to clean waste.
Okay.
This time around, we're trying to use peanut hulls. I think virtually every homes in United States will have peanut butter, right? Which is a product of several peanut hulls in different places, right? So what we're just planning to do now is to use peanut hulls as a waste from one industry to clean wastewaters from another industries, possibly mining industry, textile industries, or different industries. So that is just what we're trying to do, that, hey, we don't want peanut hulls to be an absolute waste. And for peanut hulls not to be an absolute waste, then it's better for us to use it somewhere. So this time around, instead of just disposing peanut hulls as a waste, we are using peanut hulls as a raw materials in some industries to clean their waste.
That was thank you. That was a great question, Charlene, and a great answer to that question. We're really kind of lucky as scientists to have Charlene here today to sort of ask those questions that maybe weren't, clarified in our 5-minute presentation.
So I have a master's in anthropology too. So I'm gonna ask all the human questions when it comes to things.
But
Lauren already knows that. She's dealt with me in a classroom before.
It's just great to have someone who, a non-biologist chemist here to ask questions so that it helps us understand what it is we maybe didn't make entirely clear to a more general audience. So thank you so much for your willingness to ask questions, and the ability to answer questions is just as important. In fact, when I give talks, I think it's the most fun part, answering the questions. And Tolupe, you did an excellent job answering that question.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question about your presentation, Tolupe. So I know that you mentioned that the modified peanut hulls had slightly better absorption rates than the non-modified ones. And I know you kind of included, like, it's hard of 5 minutes to include your methods. How were they modified specifically, and how did that help with absorption?
Okay. Now, at the moment, we've tried different modification methods, but now for my research, I'm using alkaline peroxide modification methods. And generally, peanut hulls is it's a dimer. It's like we have cellulose. You know, peanut hulls is an agricultural waste, right? And the agricultural waste consists of cellulose, which is a glucose dimer. I think we have a lot of scientists here. So if I'm using those words, I think you should be able to understand, right? Okay, so it has some dimers, and the dimer now consists of different functional groups. Like we have the phenolic functional group, that is carboxylic functional group, and ketone functional group, and different functional group like that. So if you modify it, it's going to leach out some of the materials in the peanut hulls. Like peanut hulls, we try to separate them into different types. We have the low density peanut hulls, we have the high density peanut hulls. We also have modified and unmodified peanut hulls. Now, the low density peanut hulls will float on water, while the high density is going to sink. Now, modified one is believed to have been having some materials that has been leached out, thereby creating some holes or some accommodation for different ions to get absorbed to it. So at the end of the day, those holes are where the ions, that is the copper ion or heavy metals, are going to put themselves in. They will just migrate into those holes and fill up those holes. So that's why if you modify the hulls, some materials will get out of the hulls, and the ions will fit into the space that has been created by the materials that left the hulls.
That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that.
You're welcome.
Tlupi, I have a follow-up question. So how are I imagine that, you're dumping this peanut byproduct into the water, it's soaking up the heavy metals, right? So now you have peanuts with heavy metals, peanut byproduct with heavy metals in it. Okay. And it seems like you want use the low density ones so you can clean that up, right? So how do you get what's the plan for, cleaning up the metal infused peanut hulls?
Okay, that's another great question. Now, there has been a series of things by which, where they use peanut hulls. For instance, if you use peanut hulls to absorb heavy metals from a wastewater, it is possible for you to dissolve the heavy metals from the peanut hulls back and reuse the peanut hulls.
Oh, wow.
So we have absorption and we have disruption. So all you need to do is just to try and use the peanut hulls to take away the metals from the wastewater, and you try to wash the peanut hulls of those things. And that's one of the things we're trying to investigate, that, hey, is this absorption method, is it a chemical reaction or a physical reaction? And that's why I said what I'm trying to study is the kinetic studies. So back to your question again. Sometimes when you, after cleaning up the wastewater from, after trying to absorb the peanut hull, the copper ion now from the wastewater, sometimes you just try to put the peanut hulls together and use the peanut hulls in such a way that the metals is not going to be leached out to the environment again. So sometimes you just use it for concrete or so many things.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And sometimes you can just bury it somewhere and plant some trees there. Some trees has the capability of taking out the heavy metals from the soil.
Oh, wow.
So thereby reducing the contamination in the environment. So it's a process that you can just continue and continue and continue until.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thank you
hope
so
that
much.
answered. Okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got a
Yeah,
related
Austin, go ahead.
question. So this is interesting, and that was one of the main things I was curious about, is how does it actually work with the removal of contaminants. But now that I've been thinking about it, are you familiar with soilless medium for hydroponic growth of plants? Because in that industry, they use coconut fibers, and that acts as a conduit to hold the plant in place and then allow a nutrient solution to pass over it. And it's interesting how you brought this up, because it's similar. Instead of copper ions, it's usually other minerals that plants need that end up getting absorbed into the coconut fibers. And so it's very similar in that nature. And of course, with yours, it makes sense to use the peanuts as a like they're the off product. So don't use something that's not an off product, but perhaps that the coconut husks are an off product for something like coconut milk or shavings for cakes or whatever you use coconut for. But have you heard of this?
What do you call? How do you spell that?
COCONUT, coconut.
Yeah, I know of coconut.
So like the outer shell of them is used in like gardening usage as a soilless medium.
Wait, are you talking about using coconut as an adsorbent for cleaning
Yes,
wastewater?
they hold
Yes.
water, and
Yes.
yeah. So
The
I
fiber,
thought that was
the fiber itself, though, the hair on the outside.
right.
Yeah, that's during my investigation, I noticed that they have used different materials to clean wastewaters in the past.
Okay.
But the thing is just, we decided to streamline our research to peanut hulls, because so far you will agree with me that the tons of peanut hulls being generated in the States is more than that of the coconut shells, the fibers you're talking about, right?
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
that is why we decided to explore that, because it's constituting waste and contamination in the environment. So it's like, why can't you use waste in the environment for another thing, instead of just dumping it somewhere and constituting something that's a nuisance in the environment? Like now, the moment you use it to clean copper iron or to clean heavy metals, definitely you have to monitor it. You don't just dump it anywhere in the environment, because it's going to constitute another nuisance there, another contamination. So it's like you just have to guard it jealously until you make sure that you don't have any heavy metals there again. I hope you understand that.
Yes.
Right, thank you.
So now I'm curious that if maybe you could use the peanut hulls in the soilless medium industry for growing plants, that like you could just use them interchangeably.
Yep, I think it's possible.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right, well, I have another question that kind of piggybacks off of everybody else's. I know that you've looked at different plants that can, or like you've looked at peanuts, but is there any other big agricultural byproducts that you think we could use, like any other kind of plants, like soybeans or corn, or have you looked into any of this, or do you know if it's a possibility?
Yes, they have used corn husk before. So corn husk has been used. Rice cobs have been used. There are several things that has been used in the past, right? But why we decided to use this? I think I mentioned it in my presentation, that it is because it is cheap, available, right? So that's one of the reasons I mentioned that. But they have used so many agricultural materials in the past, and even they have used something like cash fly ash. Yeah, they use fly ash to clean it. But the thing is just, hey, this is a waste. Don't let us waste the wastes.
That's what I just didn't know if there was something that was produced as massive as peanuts, because I know peanuts are big and soybeans are big and so is
Yeah,
corn. So
yeah.
I didn't know if there was a trend with trying to everything going toward like the agricultural byproduct waste and use that, or if that makes sense.
Yeah, so let me also ask everyone about my projects, about my research. And the question is that, can you think of any other waste products that is being massively generated in the States, more than peanut hulls, that could be used?
Well, I think corn is a big production. I don't know though, you know, if you know, because corn syrup is used in just about everything, and we grow a lot of corn in the U.S. But I don't know if it would be more than peanuts. It might be interesting to look at, you know, to do a comparison across, you know, once the peanut hull situation is fully worked out, you can do a comparison type of study to see, you know, maybe see how they compare how they work against each other and maybe how they work with each other. You know, you might increase efficiency by combining wastes.
That's a good one. Yeah. That's a good one. Thank you
Your next
very much
project.
for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Maybe I'm going to use that as part of my recommendation, you know?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any more questions for Talupe? Talupe, you did a great job answering questions. You're going to be fine in your defense, I think. We can come back to ask you questions, but maybe, does anybody have any questions for anybody else? We could give Talupe a little break. Or Talupe, do you have any questions for anybody?
Well, I think someone discussed about this. I don't know how to pronounce those names. This HWA Ovisac.
That was Lauren.
Lauren, yeah. And you're talking about a kind of competition between those, is it plants or animals now?
Yeah, sorry, I realized I literally when I recorded it had just given a presentation to like a group of forest health professionals, and so I think my brain was still a little bit in that mindset. But so there's a couple of different things at play. So the organism that's being affected is a tree, a hemlock tree, both the eastern hemlock and the Carolina hemlock. And it's being impacted by an invasive pest, which is an insect. And inside of those little woolly white ovisacs is one of those females that's laying like hundreds of eggs inside each of them. And then we are releasing an insect that is a native predator of HWA in the Pacific Northwest here to help reduce the population of the pest. And the thing is that the way that it's currently done is that we rear it's a beetle, it's a predatory beetle that eats HWA. We rear those beetles in labs, but there hasn't really been a lot of study as far as like we know that it's good to release and that it doesn't have any other impacts on other aspects of the population, but the actual like behavior of how they lay eggs hasn't been studied. So we're trying to like make that rearing process more efficient. And there's possibly some competition between individuals. We usually just throw a bunch in a cage and just get what they lay and hope for the best. But it's kind of difficult to get a large number of adults out of that. Yeah.
But I'm just curious. You said some of the ovisacs are going to lay 1 egg, while some 4 eggs. And it's like,
Yeah.
Did you know what's responsible for that?
Well, yeah, that's one of the questions too, because we didn't know before when we were looking at, we'd open up an HWA ovisac and find Laricobius eggs, right? Those are the predator beetles. And we'd find multiple, and we weren't sure if that was like two different females laying eggs, because whatever egg hatches first is going to eat whatever's around it, which includes other Laricobius eggs. So it doesn't necessarily make sense that you would have one female laying two eggs, because one of those larvae is going to eat the other, probably. And so we weren't sure, like that's just something that we can now definitively say that it is just from one female and not just like two different females laying eggs on top of each other. But it's kind of like a question to think about. We don't really know the reason for the behavior. It could be, there's like no evidence that they lay eggs as food. Like it's not like egg dumping, but we're not 100% sure on that.
Okay.
So Lauren, can you define what you mean by egg dumping?
Yeah, so sometimes insects will lay like large numbers of eggs just to like sometimes have food available for whichever larvae hatches first. So that's kind of the behavior that we're thinking it could be.
It's just interesting.
Yeah.
Because egg dumping in birds means a completely different thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Lauren, I was sort of curious about your inspiration for looking at biocontrols and sort of how you started doing, like why you decided specifically to look at this type of biocontrol. And I'm just fascinated by it in general. In a way, it scares me because it's using invasive species to get other invasive species, right? So on one part, it's a little bit frightening, but then on the other, there is obviously one that is wiping out hemlock, so that needs to be remedied, right? And I was just sort of curious about biocontrols in general and what other types there are that are maybe already implemented in Appalachia, and yeah, and just sort of a little bit of background on it and why you sort of chose to focus in on this type.
Yeah, so I will say that like most of my knowledge about biological controls that have been released in the region are specific to HWA, and there is more than one that has been used. So I can talk about some of those. And I understand whenever I tell somebody that I work with a biological control, they're like, it's going to do the same thing. And I'm like, we don't just like release it and then study it, right? So it has to be quarantined for a long time and look for other impacts. And honestly, most of, I think, the challenges with biological controls, especially like with Laricobius, is that they're so specific to HWA that they'll like, eat all of the available food and then they die because there's no food left, because their life cycle is so closely tied. It's their only food source. And when you think about just like the impacts of losing hemlock species and what they provide for other organisms, other insects, birds, how they regulate temperatures in forest ecosystems, it's a very important species, and the potential negative impacts of that, I think, outweigh the introduction of a different, because I mean, it's just almost impossible too, of like, I know a lot of people that have hemlocks at their house are like treating them chemically, and that's almost impossible to maintain. You can't treat every tree that way, and that has to be done every few years, and could have other effects on
chemical
others.
I feel like almost using chemicals you would end up having more issues within the environment than it might save the hemlock tree. But what are your repercussions of chemicals? I feel like that might be worse in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they have some that are like injected into the tree, and so it's like less, it's not like just like spraying with chemicals, but then that also is like more time consuming. I think that I wanted to focus on something that was more applied, and had a kind of an impact in the region that I live in. And so when I was looking at things related to conservation biology, and I knew that I also just really like insects, that this was something that was kind of fit both worlds, and that I wanted to try to learn more about, because actually before coming to Western was not really familiar with this problem at all. It's something I learned as I came to the university.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions for Lauren at the moment? Or questions for anybody? We can give Lauren a break. Okay, go ahead.
I can ask her one. She may, I can't remember from a long time ago, but since that, I can't remember the name of the bug that eats the hemlock woolly adelgid. I'm sorry, my brain don't.
Okay.
It's early.
It's Laricobius.
Laricobius. If they are so closely tied with the hemlock woolly adelgid, is there a way like you can like monitor it and like trap and relocate them and put them somewhere else, like when their food source goes, or is that like too much of a problem or too much effort, or?
It's probably just easier to rear another group.
Okay.
So I was
gonna say that would be an idea. I just didn't know if.
Yeah. So, and also like a lot of people are looking at like combinations of like, because some insects that do feed upon them maybe aren't as specific, and so like using a combination of insects that are released. The other part of my thesis that I did not talk about at all because there wasn't enough time, was that we're currently they're released as adults into stands, and it's kind of hard to monitor those populations because they disperse vertically into the tree, and how do you collect insects? You beat cheat, aspirate them. Sometimes I've seen like things of people like sticking like sticky balls and throwing them into the tree to like there's a whole bunch of different ways to monitor the population. And so what we were using was actually doing egg releases instead of adults, so that because they are able to mature in a natural environment. And so if you can't create that in the lab, why can't they do that outside? So we release the eggs, and then the larvae feed on the HWA, and then they drop into the soil. And so then we put soil emergence tents on top of the soil, and then caught what was coming up, and we found a lot higher recovery rates that way, and that they are successfully emerging. So that might be another protocol that we suggest for just to help with time and ease of rearing. Hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could like trap and relocate, because I know like
yeah.
But with my background, that's typically what it is. Oh, if you need this trap, relocate, put it somewhere else, let it foster or grow, do it. I just didn't know.
People usually they'll clip the branches, but then I guess you could technically, but you won't know the exact number you have. You could clip some branches and then tie them to another tree, but that it wouldn't be as high numbers. Yeah, no, that's a good question though.
Does anybody have any more questions for Lauren? We can always circle back to Lauren, but thank you, Lauren, for being on the chair there for a minute to answer some questions. Does anybody have any questions for anybody else?
I've got a question for Hannah.
Go for it.
So in your research, you show that the princess tree typically grows at a higher rate than the tulip poplar.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, in my experience, like walking around the woods, there's large amounts of tulip poplar.
Yes.
So why is that?
So the issue is I haven't really looked at the aspect of dispersal, so to say. But looking at, so like if you take the same, with my experiment, what I did is I took the same number of seedlings, put them in the same conditions, and essentially saw how they grow. Bare bones, that's what I did. So looking about you saying there's so much tulip poplars, well, they've always been a native species here. So they've always, in my brain, the way I can justify it is they've always had the upper hand and they've always had the advantage. While as princess trees, they were brought here, they've been here for about 150 years. But most of the time they were here for like in a plantation setting. So they were controlled, and they were centralized more or less, because they thought that they could send it back over to Asia for the hardwood species, because there was a market, there was a demand. However, recently, since now those plantations, that idea fell through. So now they're starting to escape and become in the wild and become more present. So since they're just now becoming and start to increase, because they've only started to increase their spread since 2000. So that's 20 years roughly that people, it's kind of like a window to where they're starting to become more and more popular, and we have no idea how they can become established and how they grow. So that's, does that answer your question?
Yes.
I think it does.
Yes. Thank you.
This isn't really a question, it's more of a comment. Like everything he said would be an awesome history thing, like an awesome history, like doing history research, just because I was going to ask you about why princess trees are even here. Like what happened to where we have princess trees here, which you just explained that to Austin, sort of.
So from what I understand, from, because I'm a wildlife biology background, so we had to learn some dendrology and things like that.
Right.
So what there's multiple things. I found one thing to where it's called princess tree because some princess from another country, and they named it after her. But what it is that the princess trees, there was a big, huge drive, from what I understand, what little bit of knowledge I've looked into it, because more science here than history. The demand for princess trees was because they produce this really pretty white wood. And so, like, because it's a hardwood, so it makes this really pretty grained, pretty wood, essentially. And it was, I think, if I get this right, was a tradition in China to, like, your kind of like your first born daughters. They make you kind of like the old timey version, like a hope chest, like a little specialty chest for all their daughters. And so that was a huge market to, oh, they don't have a lot of trees, let's mass produce this tree so that way we can sell it and send it over there and it'll be a market, and plus it's good timber here. Well, then the market died and then they were all here.
Right.
And so they're like, oh, what do we do? And so there's some plantations, and then there's some to where they still grow them in plantations, but I've not heard of very many. And typically it's actually, if you have the wild, like wild fertiles type, it's illegal to actually have and grow them. I found that out too. So I found that out because I was trying to find princess tree seeds and looking and trying to, and they're like, no, you can't have them. So you have to have the genetically sterile version in order to have them in plantations and things like that now, because I'm assuming that's because of the past 20 years, we've had such an increase in concern and everything else, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's fascinating. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I think I'm also curious about that. When you said between 5 and 90% will germinate, it's like, how those over 700,000, how can you say it's just 5%? And how do you merge 5% and 90%? The margin is wide.
So yeah, and it's ridiculous because sometimes it's 0%, which is what I had an issue with. So I had to actually go and collect a bunch of wild little seedlings that were like that year's growth, so that way I could do my study. When I've looked into it, so what happens is essentially, so like you have a flower and you have the very center of the flower to where it's pollinated, right? Well, in a tulip poplar, it looks kind of like a little pine cone that's not opened yet. And so within that pine cone, depending on where that flower is and how open it is and how much it's exposed to wind, controls how much it is or is not pollinated. So that also controls if it can even be fertilized. If it is fertilized, plus the environmental conditions, that's how you get that 5 to 90. Is it such a big gap because there's so many different factors that play into it. Does that answer your question? I think maybe. Okay.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Hannah? Well, thank you, Hannah. Well, we could circle back to you at some point, but you know, you had your time in the chair, so good job. Anybody else have any questions for anybody else? Austin, I have a question for you. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how flower color would be a barrier to gene flow, which you talked about in your talk.
Yeah, so it's interesting in the plants I study because general background, flower color, it can be selected for by insects. So pollinators will choose a specific flower color to pollinate. But the problem with this idea with my plants is they produce the fetid odor, the stinky scent. So they're typically attracting beetles and flies, and they're not typically known to go to flower color. So it's like the question being, why would there be this difference? And so the only thing I can think of is that it has to do with that there are more than one type of pollinator pollinating this plant, and that, I mean, it's been studied, and like one of the methods they used was to put this little sticky substance on the plant that would catch the pollinators in action, but this would require them to be walking on the plant, and it works good to catch like beetles and insects of that nature, but I don't know that it would necessarily catch the like flying insects. So the way I see it is it's a or what has been described is it's an incomplete barrier to gene flow, because it's like a sometimes this is how it works, sometimes not. And then so this also depends on the area and which pollinators are around. And so as part of a prior study that I've seen in the literature, and I attempted this and was unsuccessful, but we've dyed pollen grains using this little chemical dye, and then from there the pollinators would pick up the pollen and move it between plants. And so the idea was to see our plants transferring pollen between the red flowered individuals and the white flowered individuals. And so, and that's another thing that's interesting, right? Is we do see these populations that have both the red and the white flowered individuals present. But then we also see populations where there's like the blended hybrids, because they do all the taxa in this group hybridize. So like an important question is like, why aren't they all looking the same? Because shouldn't the pollen transfer between? It appears that a good reason, or a pretty viable reason for the distinction between the plants is that they are it's the pollinators have a poor service. They don't pollinate that readily, and then the other thing, well, and this is because these plants open early in the season, and not all pollinators are available at that time. And then there are, I believe, slight discrepancies between the like phenology, the opening of the flowers of the different taxa. But let's see.
So in the, I'm just trying to remember from your results. So in the populations where they were more one color, were they more genetically related to each other than the other populations that had mixed colors?
Well, not necessarily. So you're saying like the pure populations were more related to each other than?
Yeah, if they were like self, fertilizing or whatever.
Not so much. The ones that were interesting, the mixed populations were more related to each other than the other pure populations.
Oh.
And so the thoughts behind that is that it's isolation, and that there's genetic drift in the population. And I did, when I made my talk, it was a little bit earlier, and it was only 5 minutes. So I didn't quite get everything squeezed in there.
Sure.
But,
yeah,
but
no,
yes, that is interesting. The mixed population. So I had this one population that was a very interesting one. We had collected samples from 3 different taxa, the red flowered and white flowered Trillium erectum taxa, and the Trillium regelii. And all of those shared more genes in common than other populations that share the same species or color. And
So do you think it's possible like that the hybrids are less compatible in a back cross with the purebred and they're more compatible with each other?
I don't know about that. I kind of think they're all compatible.
Yeah.
It's just the like profile of genes is different. But yeah, as far as that goes, they do tend to look very similar
Right.
as far as the patterns of the wheels.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions for Austin?
Yeah, for hosting, when you're saying taxa, do you mean taxonomy?
Yes, so I use the word taxa because I'm dealing with both species and subspecies varieties. And so instead of just saying, instead of saying species, because I deal with the Trillium regelii, which is classified as its own species, and then also Trillium erectum, which is classified as its own species. However, under the Trillium erectum, I deal with the white flowered variety and the red flowered variety, which is two subspecies varieties that are named. So I use taxa and taxon rather than species or variety because I have a blend of both distinctions as my targets.
Okay. And on your slide, you wrote something like NA. What do you mean by NA?
Oh, North America.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Does anybody else have any questions for Austin? It seems we lost Charlene. Charlene, you're not out there anymore, I don't think. Are you?
Yes,
Let me
I'm
just-
here. I'm
Oh,
here.
there you are. There you are. I was just about to check. You disappeared from my
I'm
top
sorry.
line.
I'm sorry, Austin. Unfortunately, I didn't get to hear a lot of what you were saying.
Oh,
I was in and out. That's okay. I heard the gist of mostly everything, but I'm on my cell phone now because unfortunately my house internet is just given up. So it's okay. But I am here.
do you have a question?
No, I don't think so. It's okay. But thank you though.
All right. Thank you, Austin. We can always circle back if somebody thinks of a question. Now that we have Charlene on the chair here, does anybody have any questions for Charlene?
I have a quick one. I know that you mentioned like the increase in tourism related to the reintroduction of elk. And I guess I wondered, like, I was kind of curious more about the ecological role that they've been playing, and if was this more, in your opinion, was this more for like the benefit of that or tourism? I guess is what I was curious about.
Okay. Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about this. I do think that the National Park Service does make a lot of decisions based on tourism. I know that they also think about the environment. And when I first started this research, I was wanting to understand if elk were actually even here, like originally at all, because there was a lot of debate about elk moving into this region after massive waves of epidemics had killed people, had killed Native Americans, and there was more buffalo during a certain time, and I was sort of wondering if elk were also a part of that movement of animals from the west to the east because of less human predation. But it seems like elk were here based on historical documents and also archaeological evidence. Elk were here. I just don't know the numbers. So moving forward a little bit into National Park Service sort of like administrative history stuff and their wildlife management policies, they definitely went through a time where they understood that big animals brought in tourists, and they wanted some of their parks out west to have those big animals, especially elk, because they knew tourists wanted to see them. And it sort of brought in a quintessential idea of the West, right? The wilderness, the West, and what it's supposed to look like. And when those populations were depleted, because out West was also affected by the fur trade, just like Appalachia was. Appalachia was a little before. They knew that a lot of it had to do with tourism, and also what they thought was right for grazing, for grasslands and for the environment. They thought they needed a lot of big animals, but they also killed most of the predators when they were doing that because they wanted to protect the big grazers. So they put in these massive like these bounties to kill predators. So now, as I think that we all sort of see that that's being reversed, because we have wolves being reintroduced in places and things like that, and they sort of understand that there needs to be more of a balance. If you want to say it's like the 1960s that biodiversity really starts becoming a major key component of wildlife management. And then I think that all of that history sort of dictates what's happening at Smoky Mountain National Park. So you have a mixture of both. You have a want for biodiversity and for the environment to be back to a somewhat previous state before extensive European colonization. But of course, humans were here during that time. We can't forget that, the Cherokee were here and they did eat elk, and it was a part of their economies. So I don't really think that they know. I couldn't find any information based off of their public documents stating exactly what they thought elk populations were like before European colonization. However, like I said, they just sort of stated that they had an understanding they were here during Europeans, because Europeans wrote about them, which that wasn't until really extensive writings weren't until the 1700s. So we still don't have an exact idea of what their role was within the ecosystem and how it sort of worked with other animals. But we do know that they're really great for tourists. And we do see that I'm sure, I don't know, everyone's probably been to Smoky Mountain National Park, that they are a major part of the tourist industry when it comes to the natural, the environmental, like tourist industry. So it's two things. It's both. I think it's biodiversity and tourism together. That was a long answer. I am so sorry, but I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much.
Anybody else have a question for Charlene?
Is there any part of the world where we have a lot of elks? And can you see anything that is responsible for their homes? Yes. Is there
Antlers?
is there any environmental factors that's responsible for that, especially where you have them in large numbers?
So how do they affect people's homes? Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm talking about what's responsible for their horns. Their horns.
Oh, their horns. Oh, right.
Horns, and also where they have them in large quantities. What's their ecological effect there, or what's responsible for those things?
Yeah, so I don't know, unfortunately. I know that their antlers are, the males have antlers and the females don't, because they're a species of deer. So it's not like species that are related to bovines, like they have antlers on both male and female. All I know again, I'm so sorry. My biology knowledge is like this much. I mean, it's a little bit, it's enough to know history and anthropology and archaeology, but that's it. But so all I can say about their antlers is that they shed them every year. They get new ones every year, the males, and they're not something that's constant on their head. And it's made out of, I think, keratin. And that's about all that I can say about their antlers. And when it comes to like large populations, I'm sorry, what was the second half of your question? I forgot.
I asked about the ecological effects where they have them in large numbers.
Okay, sure. So With ecological effects of large numbers, I know that they will have effects on the grasslands in general. They will cause larger areas. They will eat small shrubs, and they will actually extend grasslands. So they extend areas that maybe within a forest would have a lot of underbrush and a lot of little things, and the grass isn't growing very well. They will help, I guess you could say help. They will help with clearing, clearing underbrush under forests, and will extend grasslands. I do know that if they're in large populations, they can also cause erosion, which is a bad thing. So they have good things and bad things. I know that they can cause increased erosion when it comes to rivers, which means that they need predators to keep them to where they're not along riverbanks as much, which in the West, I think it's at Yellowstone National Park, they reintroduced wolves, which has helped with erosion problems that was caused by the big grazing animals. We don't have any predator in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park that actually does that with the elk population there at the moment. They did try to reintroduce wolves. I want to say it was in the 90s. I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly, but it was before elk reintroduction, and the reintroduction failed because the wolves did not have any large predators to eat. So I don't know if they're going to retry reintroducing wolves or not now that they have a large predator within the Smoky Mountain National Park, but it is difficult because the national park here it's not very big, and there's a lot of people around the park, and there's a lot of people in the park. So having a big predator is difficult, but having prey like the elk would be helpful if they ever did that again. However, anyways, but you were asking about benefits. The only benefits that I know of is it helps the grass. It helps grass species, and it helps with keeping down brush in forests, and it also helps with, they also will eat branches, low branches, so it keeps the trees to where the branches are sort of in check, to where it has something to do with growth when it comes to trees and small branches. And again, I'm so sorry, I feel so embarrassed around a bunch of biologists who know the terms for all of this, but that's sort of what I've come to understand about them.
Thank you, Charlene. You did a good job trying to hold steady in the face of biologists. And I feel like I have to help you out here a little bit, and I don't want to embarrass you. I just want to, it's a teachable moment. I can't help it because I teach vertebrate zoology.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
I would love to know your input then, and maybe actually talk to you in the future.
I would be happy to talk to you. I would be happy to talk to any of you if you want feedback on your presentations, like more specific. I'd be happy to talk to any of you. But just to clarify the antler thing. So, so males have antlers. They're actually made out of bone. They regrow. Yep, they regrow them every year. So they have some velvet to start with that provides vascularization and nutrients for growing antlers, and then that skin, that velvet, falls off, and it's just naked bone is what those antlers are. So you can pick them up because they fall off, like you said. And males use them when they are fighting with each other. So it's kind of like a weapon that gives them an advantage in controlling a bunch of females. So their reproductive system is one male controls a bunch of females, and he has access to them for reproduction. And so that's an important resource for him, and he uses his antlers to fight off other males. So to answer Talupe's question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I had one question for you, Charlene. What do you know, if anything, about the relationship between, either historically or contemporarily, the relationship between the elk population and the Cherokee?
Sure. I don't know a whole lot. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence when it comes to this. And I would really like to one day dig more into archaeological research for this. So I used to be a zooarchaeologist, and I know of a couple zooarch labs that are around the southeastern United States that possibly would have data. I talked to Dr. White from Appalachia State, who was a zooarchaeologist, and he gave me some information. This was during the pandemic, so unfortunately he wasn't able to send me a lot of information, but we just had some email correspondence about elk being found within different time periods here in the Appalachia Summit area. But I would really like to know more about population numbers, but in general, we were just talking about their presence, and also I would like to know more about how they were used by indigenous peoples and the Cherokee, as in how how bones were used, how everything, just different things that were, if they were different parts of an elk that were more important than others for different things, just all those questions when it comes to like anthropology and archaeology stuff. I do know a little bit about the writing. So what I've picked up about people writing, there's a couple main sort of main historical documents sort of going to Audubon talked about elk a little bit in Appalachia towards the end of the fur trade when they were disappearing. I feel like that's a big name everyone would recognize. I'm trying to think who else. There's a couple other people who came through this area to write about the Cherokee. I think I mentioned Daniel Buttrick in my talk. I'm pretty sure that's why I'd mentioned. He was interviewing Cherokee elders through the area and talking to them about cultural things. And within one interview, this was after elk was already eradicated from the area, but the elder had mentioned, and he didn't say if it was a woman or a man, so I don't know. All I can say is an elder. That individual had said that they did eat elk, that it was proper, because there's some animals that have taboos against them and aren't eaten, and so elk were okay to eat. Because I was curious about that, if they were a taboo or not. In the Cherokee language, elk and deer have the same name, so they're both called deer, which
they're called those elk are called red deer in Europe too. So elk are found very widely in Europe, and they're called red deer in Europe.
Yeah, right. And I know that they're a close relative. So with the Cherokee specifically, though, they have a word for deer, and it is the same for elk now, and they call it a big deer in their language. Okay, so and normally I should have wrote it down because I know what that is, but I can't remember it off the top of my head right now. Anyways, but speaking to people though, speaking to a couple people on the Qualla boundary that work in government there, they're not sure if that term is something that was developed more recently, or if that is because there are no references specifically to elk within mythology or stories or anything like that, or traditional stories. So they're not entirely sure if that's just what they've always called them, was big deer. And deer was like a catch-all term, like how we have our family names and we have our sort of catch-all sort of family terms where a whole bunch of animals will fit into one family. It could be similar within their classification system, because different cultures have different classification systems for animals. So within their classification system, it is a deer. So why not call it a deer, right? So it's just a big deer. So maybe that's all, simple as that, right? So there is a question of, is it simple as that, or is it something that they've lost the word for it in the language because it's 200 years since they've really talked about elk within the area? And if this is something that's a little bit, if this is something more that maybe was used later on, either way, they have a term for elk, and they are very much involved with the joint management of the elk with the park.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Charlene. Well, it's very interesting to think about the history of the elk in the area. So we're coming to the end of our time, right? So we have till 10, that's correct. And then, so I figure maybe some people have things that they have to do. So I just wanted to wrap up a little bit before we all go. I just wanted you to sort of think about, I mean, I think the fact that we have talked till the very end of this means that you all did a good job presenting your interesting research. And so thank you all for doing that. And I hope that you enjoyed discussing it with each other. I thought it was kind of fun, so I hope you had fun too. But I want you to think about really one of the benefits of giving talks is getting this kind of feedback, right? And we've been able to get really extended feedback here that should make you, maybe give you insights into the kinds of things you might want to include in future talks. What are the kinds of questions that people are asking? And those are the kinds of things that people are thinking about that you might want to address in a future version of your talk. And maybe, you know, you'll have more time in a longer version of your talk. And probably more importantly, it might give you insights into your research that you hadn't thought of before. So you can, you know, you can think about, well, what other kinds of studies can I do? Or can I include that insight in a discussion, for example, something like that. So I think I just wanted to leave you with that thought. And also to say again, you know, I'd be happy to talk to any one of you if you wanted like specific feedback about, you know, putting together a talk or any comments I might have about your talk. Please feel free to email me. We can set up a Zoom meeting and I would be happy to talk to you about it. Does anybody else have any final thoughts that they would want to say before we sign out? All right, well, I'll thank you all again. It was a great conversation. I did learn a lot. Oh, Austin, I see a hand there.
Sorry, I was just waving.
Oh, you were waving goodbye. All right, great. Well, then I guess we will take our leave from each other and look forward to seeing each other's talks, you know, in VC's defenses and that sort of thing. I know I'll look forward to seeing you all again, especially you, Austin.
I'll be at ASB in an hour, so
oh, okay.
I don't know,
Wow.
Hannah's there.
All
yeah,
right, so
they did. They picked out of the 365 days we have, they put the two.
They picked the same day. Good job. Yeah. Well, good luck to you guys. You're really prepared now to. You've had some good practice, so you'll be stars at the ASB, I'm sure. All right, guys. Thanks again.